The debate hall was alive with chatter, laughter, and the restless shuffling of notebooks, yet one chair always remained empty. It stood like an accusation beside Marcus. Every day he took his place in the third row, second seat from the left, laying his pen and notebook neatly before him, ready to absorb whatever the professor had to give. And every day, as the hall filled and chairs scraped against the floor, no one sat beside him. It was never spoken aloud, yet everyone noticed. Some students glanced at the chair as if it carried an unseen danger. Some began to lower themselves toward it only to reconsider at the last second, moving away with flimsy excuses. I promised a friend I'd sit by them, or I need the outlet near the wall. Marcus had learned not to expect anyone. By October, the sight of that vacant seat felt as permanent as the blackboards themselves. Marcus told himself he didn't care. He was not here to be liked, not here to gather laughter or friendships. He was here because his mother had worked double shifts to pay the bills, because scholarships had opened a narrow but precious door, and because he carried inside him a hunger for knowledge. An empty chair was a small price to pay, or so he repeated like a mantra. Yet the silence pressed against him each morning. The laughter and inside jokes that fluttered around the room always seemed to draw a line he could not cross. He became used to being invisible, though the wound of invisibility is its own kind of scar. Professor Reynolds entered with his usual brisk pace, a leather satchel in one hand, his silver hair catching the harsh light. His voice, calm and deliberate, carried through the room. "Today," he announced, "we begin preparing for the intercollegiate debates. You will need partners. Choose wisely. Debating is not only about words, but about trust, rhythm, and balance." The class shifted into motion. Students turned, whispering, some already sliding their notebooks toward chosen partners. Smiles flashed, laughter rose, hands pointed. Marcus sat still, his pen balanced across his knuckles. He waited, though a sinking certainty already filled him. One by one, pairs formed. Across the aisle, a girl leaned toward her friend, their heads almost touching. Two boys slapped hands and grinned, already planning strategies. Marcus stared at his notebook, willing someone to speak, to glance his way, to break the unspoken rule that surrounded him. No one did. "Anyone without a partner?" Reynolds asked. A few tentative hands went up. He quickly suggested they pair with others nearby. The professor's gaze swept the room, pausing on Marcus for a moment. The boy looked up briefly, then dropped his eyes back to the desk. The empty chair glared at him, its silence louder than the chatter surrounding it. That afternoon, the cafeteria thundered with clattering trays, the squeal of sneakers against linoleum, voices competing to be heard. Marcus sat alone at a corner table, spooning mashed potatoes without appetite. He unlocked his phone, scrolling through messages until one from his mother lit the screen. "Proud of you. Remember why you're there. Keep shining, baby." His lips trembled into the smallest smile as he typed, "Love you, Mom. Trying my best." When he looked up, his eyes wandered to the clusters of students around him. They shared fries, swapped jokes, nudged each other with casual affection. He envied the easy comfort of their belonging. For him, every seat near his was like that empty chair in class, marked with an invisible barrier. He remembered his first day vividly. The morning sun had painted the university's gates in golden light, making the campus look like the beginning of a dream. He had stepped inside with his backpack strapped tight, his sneakers worn but clean, his notebooks fresh and full of possibility. He had chosen his seat carefully. Not too far in the back to be ignored, not too boldly in front to be a target. He had sat up straight, ready to prove himself. The first student who entered glanced at him and shifted to another seat. Marcus dismissed it. The second did the same. By the third, his chest tightened. By the 10th, his smile faded into silence. And when the professor began class, Marcus realized the space around him was more than coincidence. It was exile. The weeks turned the pattern into ritual. When groups formed, Marcus was left behind. When whispers filled the air, his name was spoken only in low tones, followed by snickers. He heard fragments sometimes, words like weird, quiet, and worse. A sharp laugh behind him once carried the cruel line, "Better not sit there, you'll catch his bad luck." Marcus clenched his jaw and focused harder on his notes. He reminded himself of his mother's tired face, of the cracked leather on her shoes from working extra shifts. He told himself that his purpose was greater than their cruelty. But no matter how many times he repeated it, the empty chair still mocked him. One evening, as he walked back from the library, Marcus passed two classmates whispering under a street lamp. "Why does no one sit next to him?" a girl asked. "Because he's different," the boy muttered. "You know, people just don't feel comfortable." Marcus walked faster, their voices chasing him like shadows. By November, the debates drew closer. Professor Reynolds grew stricter, assigning topics, timing students with a stopwatch. The man was respected, feared, even admired, but above all, he demanded fairness. The day of practice debates, Marcus sat as usual, notebook open, pen ready. He had spent nights preparing arguments, his words carefully crafted like weapons waiting for battle. He wanted to shine, to prove himself. "Partners, prepare your cases," Reynolds instructed. Chairs screeched as students leaned into each other, whispering strategies. Marcus sat alone. The professor's gaze found him again. "Marcus," Reynolds asked, "do you have a partner?" Silence spread across the room. Eyes turned, then darted away. No one spoke. "No, sir," Marcus answered softly. The words seemed to hang in the air. Reynolds's face tightened. Slowly, with deliberate calm, he walked down the aisle, his shoes tapping like a metronome. When he reached Marcus's row, he paused, then lowered his satchel onto the empty chair. The sound of the leather hitting the wood echoed. And then, before the stunned eyes of the class, Professor Reynolds sat down beside Marcus. The silence in the room thickened, but this time it was not cruel. It was charged, electric, waiting. Reynolds adjusted his glasses and turned to Marcus. "Shall we begin?" Marcus blinked, caught between disbelief and relief. His chest swelled with something he hadn't felt in weeks: dignity. For the first time, the empty chair was no longer empty. Gasps rustled through the classroom when Professor Reynolds lowered himself into the chair. A boy in the back snickered, quickly silenced by a sharp glance from the professor. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as though this small act of solidarity had disturbed an order they had never dared to question. Marcus's pulse thundered in his ears. He had prepared for rejection, for whispers, for the long, familiar sting of being overlooked. He had not prepared for this. His own professor, a man who commanded the respect of the entire faculty, had chosen to sit where no student dared. The professor placed his pen neatly on the desk and faced Marcus with a calm smile. "Education," he said softly, "is not about who will sit beside you, but who is willing to stand with you. Shall we show them what that means?" Marcus swallowed, nodding slowly. "Yes, sir." The weight of the room shifted. Students leaned forward, eyes darting between Marcus and Reynolds, whispering behind cupped palms. Some looked embarrassed, others annoyed. But a few, just a few, watched with something like curiosity. Reynolds called the first pair to the front. The debate began. Voices clashed, arguments rose and fell, notes rustled, the stopwatch clicked. Yet Marcus felt none of it. His eyes stayed fixed on his notebook, his hands trembling just slightly. For the first time, the chair beside him was not empty. For the first time, he felt chosen. That evening, Marcus walked back to his dorm under a sky littered with stars. The campus was alive with chatter and music from nearby apartments, but Marcus walked alone, his bag heavy against his shoulder. Yet tonight his steps were lighter. He thought of the professor's words. Education is not about who will sit beside you, but who is willing to stand with you. For weeks he had carried silence like a chain. Tonight the chain felt looser. He remembered how the professor had looked at him, not with pity, not with impatience, but with respect. That respect burned inside him like a small, steady flame. And for the first time since stepping onto campus, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe the chair beside him wasn't cursed. Maybe it had been waiting for someone brave enough to sit down. The next morning, the class entered the debate hall buzzing with leftover whispers from the day before. "Can you believe Reynolds actually sat with him?" one girl muttered. "He's making a point," her friend replied. But still, it was awkward. Marcus ignored the voices. He placed his notebook on the desk, his usual ritual. But this time, when his eyes flicked to the empty chair, it no longer looked like an enemy. It looked like a promise. When Reynolds entered, his gaze swept the room as always, but when his eyes found Marcus, he gave the smallest nod, almost invisible, yet strong enough to anchor Marcus's spirit. The professor took his usual place at the front of the room, but Marcus knew. Yesterday had changed something. For the first time, Marcus dared to sit straighter, his shoulders squaring not from defense but from quiet pride. The chair beside him remained empty again that day, but not in the same way. Now the silence around it hummed with possibility. And so the days turned. The debates continued, students pairing off, voices clashing in arguments about society, history, economics. But Marcus no longer felt like an outcast observer. When the professor had filled that empty chair, he had filled something else too. Marcus's belief in his own place in the room. The whispers did not stop. Some students still snickered, still avoided him. Yet Marcus carried himself differently now. The chair was no longer his shame. It was his badge, his reminder that courage did not always come from the crowd. Sometimes it came from one voice, one choice, one act of sitting down where others feared to. As autumn deepened and the air grew crisp with the smell of fallen leaves, Marcus knew one truth. The debates ahead would not just be about ideas. They would be about proving that silence could speak, that isolation could become strength, that an empty chair could change an entire room. And when that moment came, Marcus promised himself he would be ready. The campus buzzed with anticipation for the upcoming debates. Posters lined the walls of the humanities building, promising prizes, recognition, and the honor of representing the university. For many students, it was an exciting challenge. For Marcus, it was a chance to prove that his voice mattered, that he could not only belong in the room but stand at its center. Every afternoon, he met with Professor Reynolds in a quiet corner of the library. The professor carried only a notebook and a thermos of coffee, while Marcus brought stacks of articles and handwritten notes covered in scribbled arguments. "You over-prepare," Reynolds observed one day. Glancing at the pile, Marcus shifted nervously. I don't want to be caught off guard." The professor leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Preparation is important, but debates are not only about what you know, they're about what you feel and how you deliver it. Confidence is as persuasive as logic." Marcus frowned. "But if I make a mistake, they'll laugh." "They already—" He hesitated, lowering his eyes. "They already think I don't belong." Reynolds' voice softened. "Marcus, sometimes people will decide who you are before you've said a single word. That's their blindness, not yours. Your job is to speak so clearly, so powerfully, that their blindness becomes impossible to maintain." Marcus swallowed hard. The professor's words sank deep. From that day, their practice sessions changed. Instead of drowning Marcus in facts, Reynolds taught him to stand, to project, to argue as if the world depended on it. They timed speeches, sharpened rebuttals, even rehearsed pauses. Slowly, Marcus felt his voice grow steadier, his presence larger. When the day of the practice debates arrived, the atmosphere in the hall was electric. Students whispered nervously, flipping through notes, straightening ties and blouses as though preparing for a trial. Marcus sat in his usual seat, but this time the empty chair beside him felt different. It was no longer a symbol of exclusion. It was a reminder of the professor's quiet defiance, of the hours they had spent together sharpening his voice. Reynolds stood at the podium. "We'll begin with team demonstrations. Marcus and I will take the affirmative position. Education builds society more than wealth." Whispers rippled through the class. A student muttered, "Of course he gets the professor." Another added, "This'll be weird." Marcus felt their eyes on him, but instead of shrinking, he straightened his shoulders. He rose, clutching his notes, and walked with measured steps to the front. The room went quiet. Reynolds opened the debate with calm authority, laying out the foundation, that education creates thinkers, innovators, and leaders, while wealth without knowledge crumbles. Then he nodded to Marcus. Marcus took a breath. His heart pounded like a drum. He looked out at the rows of faces, some skeptical, some curious, some outright dismissive. For a moment, doubt nearly swallowed him whole. Then he remembered his mother's message. "Keep shining, baby." He lifted his chin. His voice, when it came, was steady. "Education," Marcus began, "is not a luxury reserved for the wealthy. It is the foundation of every society that has ever thrived. Wealth can buy comfort, but it cannot buy wisdom. Wealth can build walls, but only education can build bridges." The words rolled out stronger than he expected. He saw heads lift. A few pens began to scribble notes. He pressed on, his voice growing firmer. "History shows us that civilizations rise not on piles of gold, but on the spread of ideas. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the civil rights movements, all were fueled not by wealth, but by knowledge shared, by minds refusing to stay silent." A hush settled over the hall. Even the students who had laughed at him before were listening now. Marcus's hands no longer shook. His voice grew bolder, his arguments sharper. For the first time, he was not the boy beside the empty chair. He was a speaker commanding the room. When the opposing team rose to counter, their arguments faltered under Marcus's rebuttals. He had anticipated their points, prepared counter-evidence, and delivered it with precision. Each time he spoke, his voice cut through the air like a blade, leaving silence in its wake. Reynolds watched with quiet pride, stepping in only to support, never to overshadow. He knew the class wasn't just hearing Marcus's words. They were witnessing his transformation. By the end, when Marcus delivered his closing statement, "If wealth defines society, it serves only the few. But if education defines it, it serves us all." The room erupted in unexpected applause. Not everyone clapped. A few arms remained crossed, faces tight with resistance. But many students who had once avoided him now looked at him with something new: respect. Marcus returned to his seat, chest heaving, adrenaline still burning in his veins. For the first time in months, he felt seen. The empty chair beside him, though unoccupied, seemed to glow with quiet triumph. That night, Marcus lay awake in his dorm, staring at the ceiling. The applause still echoed in his ears. He thought about the classmates who had clapped, the ones who had avoided eye contact, the ones who looked unsettled. He realized something important. Change didn't happen all at once. It began like ripples, small, spreading, impossible to ignore. And he had just made the first ripple. Over the next week, things began to shift. Subtly at first, a student who once whispered cruel jokes now asked him about an article he'd cited. Another, who had always sat far across the room, moved a row closer. The chair beside him remained empty most days, but it was no longer avoided with the same sharp recoil. The fear that had once surrounded it seemed to thin like mist under sunlight. Still, prejudice lingered. Marcus heard the mutters, saw the sidelong glances. Not everyone was ready to change, but he no longer carried their rejection like a burden. He carried his voice instead. Professor Reynolds continued to mentor him quietly. "You've started something," he told Marcus after class one day. "The applause you heard? That wasn't just for your argument. That was for your courage. And courage," he added with a smile, "is contagious." Marcus walked through campus with a new stride. The same students who once whispered now watched him with curiosity. Some nodded in greeting. A few even stopped him to ask about debate techniques. For the first time, Marcus didn't feel like the boy defined by an empty chair. He felt like someone who had something to give, and yet deep down, he knew the greatest test was still to come, the real intercollegiate debate, where he would face not just his classmates but competitors from other universities. There, his voice would not only need to shine, it would need to blaze. The night before the debate, Marcus sat at his desk, his lamp casting a soft circle of light on his notes. He read through his arguments again and again, but the words seemed to blur. He pushed the papers aside and stared at the chair across from him, his roommate's chair, empty while the roommate was out. The sight stirred something inside him. Empty chairs had once haunted him. Now they had become symbols of absence, yes, but also of possibility. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, I will not just fill a chair, I will fill the room." And for the first time, he believed it. The debate topic that morning was one students had anticipated for weeks. Does equality exist in modern society, or is it only an illusion? The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. For him, equality was no abstract argument. It was lived reality, carved into every empty seat beside him, whispered in every sidelong glance. Professor Reynolds scanned the room. "Pair up," he announced as always. Chairs scraped, notebooks shuffled, familiar partners drifted together. Marcus braced himself for the sting of solitude. But then the professor's voice broke the rhythm. "Marcus, you'll lead today." The words echoed like a bell. Heads turned. Marcus blinked, caught between dread and disbelief. "Lead, sir?" he asked cautiously. Reynolds smiled, firm but encouraging. "Yes, take the floor. Share your thoughts." A wave of murmurs rippled across the hall. A few students rolled their eyes. Others smirked as though expecting Marcus to stumble. But Marcus rose slowly, notebook clutched to his chest. His legs felt like stone, yet something in his chest, perhaps that small flame Reynolds had lit, pushed him forward. He stepped to the front, placed his notebook on the lectern, and looked at the class. The silence was thick. Daring him to falter, he took a breath. Equality, he began, his voice low but steady, is not just about laws or policies. It's about perception. You can legislate fairness, but you cannot legislate the human heart. A hush fell. Pens stopped scratching. Marcus continued, his words gathering strength. Every day people are measured, not by their ideas, not by their actions, but by the color of their skin, the clothes they wear, the accent in their voice. That measurement isn't equality. It's judgment disguised as normalcy. His voice grew firmer, the tremble fading. Some of you may think equality is real because you've never had to notice when it's absent. But for others, every empty chair, every avoided glance, every silence speaks louder than any constitution. Equality exists only when hearts choose to see each other without fear. The room was still. Marcus closed his notebook softly. That's my position. Equality in practice is still an illusion, unless we are brave enough to make it real. He stepped back. For a moment, no one moved. Then from the back row, a pair of hands clapped, hesitant, awkward, but genuine. Another joined. Then another. Not everyone clapped, but the sound was enough to break the invisible wall that had always surrounded him. Reynolds nodded once, his expression unreadable, but Marcus caught the glint of approval in his eyes. The debates continued, partner after partner. Some argued passionately for progress, citing statistics and reforms. Others dismissed Marcus's view as too emotional. But even those who disagreed found themselves repeating his words, responding to his points, acknowledging his presence. By the end of class, Marcus was no longer invisible. That night, Marcus sat in his dorm room replaying the moment. His phone buzzed with a message. Unknown number. Strong speech today. Didn't expect that. Lena. Marcus frowned, scrolling his memory. Lena. One of the students who always sat near the middle, sharp-tongued, quick with counter-arguments. She had never spoken to him directly. He typed back cautiously. Thanks. 3 dots appeared. You shook them. Keep doing it. Marcus stared at the screen, a strange warmth spreading through him. For the first time, someone his age had reached across the divide. The chair beside him was still empty. But maybe not for long. In the following weeks, Marcus became a quiet force in the classroom. He didn't dominate, didn't raise his voice unnecessarily, but when he spoke, people listened. Even those who rolled their eyes began taking notes when his turn came. Lena, true to her message, often nodded along, sometimes even defending his points during rebuttals. Slowly others followed, one by one, inching closer to acknowledgement. The transformation wasn't sudden or complete. Some students still avoided him, still whispered. But the current had shifted. Marcus was no longer the shadow in the corner. He was becoming part of the conversation, and each time he sat down, that once empty chair seemed less like a wound and more like a symbol. The true test came one Friday afternoon. The debate topic, what defines leadership? Marcus had prepared extensively, scribbling notes late into the night. His desk cluttered with books and highlighted articles. But when Reynolds announced, today Marcus and Lena will partner, Marcus froze. Partner. For the first time, the chair beside him scraped against the floor as Lena slid into it. Notebook in hand, offering a small smile. The room buzzed with whispers, some incredulous, some mocking, but Marcus only heard the steady beat of his own heart. They stood together at the front. Lena opened. Marcus followed. Their voices, different yet harmonious, wove arguments seamlessly. Leadership, Marcus declared, is not about who holds authority but who inspires trust. And trust, Lena added, cannot exist where prejudice lives. True leaders see beyond surface differences. They see people, their rhythm built, each point amplifying the other, until even the skeptics leaned forward, compelled by the unexpected alliance. When they finished, the applause was louder, fuller, undeniable. For the first time, Marcus returned to his chair not alone, but beside someone who had chosen to sit there willingly. The empty chair was no longer empty, and the classroom, once divided, had begun to change. That night, Marcus stood outside under the autumn sky, the wind tugging at his jacket. He thought of the boy who had once shrunk beneath whispers, who had once accepted silence as his fate. Now he thought of the professor's courage. He thought of Lena's choice, and he thought of his own voice, finally free, finally heard. The empty chair had been a symbol of rejection. Now it had become a stage for revolution, and Marcus knew this was only the beginning. Winter crept onto campus with quiet frost, painting the debate hall windows in delicate lace. Students shuffled in, wrapped in scarves and coats, their breaths clouding in the cold air. Yet beneath the chill of the season, something had warmed within the classroom. Marcus was no longer a ghost at the margins. Lena sat beside him often, sometimes others too, their notebooks sharing space on the desk once shunned. The whispers hadn't vanished entirely, but they carried less venom, their power weakened by the undeniable force of his voice. Still, the chair's story was not yet complete. Professor Reynolds had promised one final debate, one that would decide the semester's legacy. The theme, he announced, his voice carrying weight, is "What is the purpose of education?" Students leaned forward, pencils ready. It was a grand question, bigger than politics or policies. It was about why they were here at all. Reynolds scanned the room before his eyes settled on Marcus. "I want you," he said, "to close the semester with your answer." The air shifted. Marcus felt the familiar surge of nerves claw at his stomach. But this time he didn't shrink. He rose, notebook in hand, and stepped to the front. He looked at the room, not just at the faces, but at the history between them. The avoidance, the whispers, the shift, the chair, and he began. Education, he said, his voice firm, is not just about books or exams. It is about courage. The courage to see what we have ignored. The courage to sit where no one else will sit. The courage to listen, even when the truth is uncomfortable. He let the words breathe before continuing. This chair, he gestured toward the seat beside his, was empty for weeks. Not because it was broken, not because it lacked comfort, but because no one wanted to be associated with me. That is not education. That is fear dressed up as indifference. A ripple of discomfort passed through the class. Some lowered their eyes. Others fidgeted. But Marcus pressed on. True education begins when we stop letting fear decide who deserves to be heard. It begins when we sit beside each other. Not because we look the same or think the same, but because we are willing to learn together. Hearts must sit together before minds can grow. He paused, then smiled slightly. Professor Reynolds showed me that. And Lena reminded me of it. But now it's on all of us. The room was silent. Marcus felt his pulse pounding, but he held his gaze steady. Education, he finished, is not about filling an empty chair. It is about choosing to no longer leave it empty. He closed his notebook. For a moment, only the wind against the windows spoke. Then Reynolds began to clap, slow, deliberate. Lena followed, her palms sharp against the air. And then, one by one, the entire class joined, until the hall echoed with applause that seemed to shake the frost from the windows. Marcus stood tall, the sound washing over him not as charity, but as recognition. After class, as students filed out, several lingered near Marcus's desk. A tall boy hesitated, then spoke. I shouldn't have avoided sitting here, he admitted awkwardly. You made me think, another added. Same, I guess I was scared of what people would think. Lena shot them both a wry smile. Took you long enough, Marcus chuckled softly. A weight lifting. That evening he found Reynolds in his office, shelves stacked with worn books, a faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. Professor, Marcus said, why did you sit beside me that day? You could have ignored it like everyone else. Reynolds leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. Because silence teaches nothing, Marcus, and because I knew the class needed a lesson no textbook could give. He tapped his pen against the desk. You've given them more than I ever could. That chair is no longer empty, and neither are you. Marcus swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. Thank you, sir, Reynolds smiled. Don't thank me. Thank yourself for being brave enough to fill the space others left behind. Spring arrived. The frost melted, flowers bloomed, and the debate hall took on new light. The once feared chair had become a quiet landmark, a reminder of change. Students now sat there without hesitation, sometimes even competing for the spot. But Marcus always remembered. He remembered when it was empty, when it burned with silence. And he remembered the day it became more than just furniture. It became a symbol. On graduation day, as Marcus crossed the stage to accept his diploma, he scanned the crowd. In the audience, his family beamed, tears in their eyes. Among the faculty, Reynolds gave a small, proud nod. Marcus knew his journey was only beginning. The world outside still had empty chairs, still had silences waiting to be broken. But now he carried the strength to sit in them, to invite others to sit too. Because real education wasn't about degrees or titles. It was about what he had learned in a quiet debate hall. That the bravest lessons begin when someone chooses to sit down.